Hi, I'm Hannah. I work here at Heritage in our wholesale department.
Hi, I'm Nick, and I work in the mail order department. And we're going to show you how to cook some of our Akushi Wagyu ribeyes. We have over here our bone-in ribeye steak, our single bone ribeye roast, and then the standing rib roast.
And I think they're pretty much all the same steak, just different sizes.
Sure.
And
The roast is, multiple cuts of these steaks. So if you do end up buying a large roast and you wanted to cut them into steaks, you could and make, smaller pieces like this. Let's get started.
Okay, so I think ribeyes are actually one of the easiest steaks to cook. I think they look so impressive, but they're pretty much nice, even thickness throughout. And I like to do mine in the pan all the way. We do have our oven on in case we want to bring it up to temp a little bit more in the oven, but I try and do the whole thing on the stovetop.
And this is about a 2-inch thick single bone rib roast, which is somewhere in between our steak and our standing rib roast.
This is about 3 pounds.
So you can consider this like a centerpiece for 2.
So for my ribeyes, I like to be really simple and just use salt. Especially if it's the first time you're having that cut from wherever you get it from, it's nice to do just salt and taste the real beefy flavor. I find that when ribeyes are this thick, it's kind of hard to over season them. As much salt as you can get to stick to the outside, all 4 sides.
So a lot of it will
Should be
fall
good.
off in the pan.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also a steak should be very well seasoned. If you think of it and you want to do this a day ahead and leave it in your fridge, that's great too, but if you don't, it'll be delicious either way. I'm going to cook it in its own fat. So you can see it has a nice bit of a fat cap. Every steak obviously is different, so you just want to check out the fat cap and see how much fat we can render off. But I like to start on this side. And if you can hear it, that means our pan is hot enough. So I'm going to render off as much of that fat cap as I can.
How hot is your pan?
It's hot, it's very hot. I think where you can go wrong with these is if the pan is not hot enough and the internal temperature gets where you want it to be before the outside has a nice crust. So for me, a really hot pan and just get as much really deep, dark brown color on the outside, and then we can worry about the internal temp later. Ideally, the internal temp will still be low when our outside crust is where we want it to be, but the opposite of that obviously would be a problem. If we don't have enough crust and the internal temperature is where we want it to be, that's kind of a little bit trickier to fix. So yeah, very hot pan.
Now this technique can be used with our smaller steaks as well.
Yeah,
It's just going to cook a lot faster
Yes.
than the thicker single bone rib roast.
And it's also great for strip steaks because they have that nice thick fat cap. We do have a little bit of oil here in case there's not enough fat, but also once we sear it off on either side, it's going to start to release a lot of that internal fat, and then it'll keep basting itself in its own fat. So you can see it's already starting to get a little color. I like to really push it. I think something you learn working in restaurants is to push things to their limit. So I'm basically going to get it as brown as I can on the outside without actually burning it. So yeah, like a lot more than that. We have a little ways to go.
We're still in like a honey amber color.
Yeah.
We want to get it like a deep caramelized
Like as
brown.
dark as you can get it without it burning, which is pretty dark. And this is going to take a while. And also, as you're doing this, you're warming up the rest of the steak, so the rest of this will go a little bit quicker, but this is where you really want to take a lot of time rendering out all that fat so we can use it to cook the steak. I think something too people have a tendency to do with steaks when they cook them at home is, tell me if you disagree, but I think people are afraid to move it around. I think people hear like, oh no, you're not supposed to touch a steak, you're not supposed to move it around. I'm not moving it around so much that it doesn't get color, but I am checking on it and moving it around the pan so that it gets nice even heat and the color's even. I mean, no steak is perfectly flat, so if you move it as you're cooking it, you'll get more even cooking. I mean, you do have to let it do its thing, but don't be afraid to check it and keep checking in with it along the way. All right, so I think we're pretty much there. You can see it's like a really dark golden brown crust.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And you can, it's actually crunchy already.
Let's see it over here. Yeah, that's gorgeous.
So now I'm just gonna go ahead and pick one side to start with. You can tell the pan is still nice and hot. You can hear it, you can see it, you can smell it. And there's not a ton of fat collected in the pan yet. I think there'll be more, and we can add some oil, but
there's some nice, you know, internal fat here that as we're searing the sides, that will start to render out. You know, depending on the steak, you know, you have this fat cap here, but you also have that internal fat and connective tissues and stuff that will render out into the pan.
all right, so the same idea here applies. It's okay to check it and look at the bottom. Don't keep moving it constantly because then it won't get enough color, but I do want to check and see kind of where we're at. And again, like it is good to move it around in the pan, help it cook more evenly. So you can see it's starting to get a little bit of browning. We want the whole thing to be really crusty, delicious, crunchy.
Now, once we get both sides browned, what are our two options from there?
So once we get both sides browned, I'm gonna check the internal temperature with a thermometer. We're also gonna poke it a lot and kind of get a sense of how done it is from that. And then we can either keep cooking it on the stovetop, but you're gonna flip it a lot more to make sure that you don't burn the outside, but still let the inside catch up in temperature. Or we can take this whole pan and put it in the oven. So I have the oven set to 450. And so if we're a couple degrees off from our desired internal temperature, we can just throw it in the oven for a few more minutes and keep an eye on it until it gets there.
What temp are you going to pull this off to?
Well, I think I'm gonna go for like 95 degrees because then we're gonna give it a really solid like 20 minutes rest. I think when they're this thick, you really need to give it like at least 15, 20 minutes to rest. And then hopefully it'll be around like 115, 120. Obviously it's better to undercook it and bring it up later. But yeah, I think that giving it plenty of time to rest is also one of the most important things when it comes to getting it to your desired temperature.
I think that was one of the biggest things learning in a restaurant was like, it's okay if it's undercooked a little bit, as long as you don't send it to the table.
Yeah.
You can always continue cooking.
I used to do that like when I would get really, really busy at the restaurant that I worked at, the steak place. Sometimes I would intentionally undercook all my steaks just because I knew that when it came time to plate them, you can fix it. Whereas if you get caught up in doing, and the same thing applies at home, like if you're cooking a big dinner and you have a million things to do, just pull the steak when you think it's a little undercooked and you'll feel much better going into it than if you worry that it's overcooked.
You know, you can always have these steaks ready to go at that 95 to 100, 115, and then blast them in a really hot oven for like 5-10 minutes and bring them up to your target temp just before serving. And because it's rested for that long, you don't really need to rest it that much more after you come out of the hot oven.
No, just like on the way to the table.
Yeah.
And that's where I think these ribeyes are really easy actually because they're super forgiving. You don't have to worry about like, you know, with a thinner cut, you have to worry about overcooking it. With this, you more just want to worry about the crust, and then we'll figure out the internal temperature right before we serve it. So I think we're getting there. That looks nice. I might push it a little bit more. You can see this side hasn't been hitting the pan, so I'm going to use my tongs just to kind of make sure that part of the steak gets nice color on it too. A lot more fat has come out, and that's gonna just be really delicious. It's gonna be basting in its own fat as we cook it. All right, so you can see now it's caught up a little bit on that side, and we have a really beautiful crust. So I'm gonna flip it again. And we're basically trying to match the crust on the other side. The pan is nice and hot, as you can see from the smoke, and that ensures, hopefully, that the inside is not gonna overcook before the outside is nice and brown. And if you feel it now, this is, I mean, it's raw. So that's a good way to get familiar with the way a steak feels as it's cooking, is to feel it when it's raw.
Just for fun, let's see where we're actually at temperature-wise.
So for ribeyes, you just want to be careful you don't hit the bone because that's going to give you a false reading. So sometimes it's hard to tell like where the tip of this actually is, even if you've used one a lot. So you can stand it up on its side, go down through the eye, and when you hit the bone, you can pull it back to make sure. We're basically trying to get the temperature right here, which says it's at 53, which is probably true. But I also like to take the temperature in a couple different places, and it's all reading in the low 50s. So the temperature's in the low 70s, and we're looking for mid 90s. So we're getting close. So now is when I would start to look at the steak. You can see both sides are nice and crusty. I might try and get some more crust on this last side here.
Some while we have the points.
While we have the chance. You can see a lot more fat rendering off, which is delicious.
Now at this point, you're comfortably flipping this over.
Yeah.
Because
so
you're good with the color.
I'm good with the color. We can get a little bit more. Like, I'm not worried about the outside browning at this point, but I basically want to just kind of buy some time so that that internal temperature can get higher. And I think that's like one of those old wives' tales too, that you should only flip a steak once. I think.
I guess it makes sense on a grill, right?
Yeah, but even then, it's like
there's hot spots and cold spots.
Yeah, the more you move it around, the better chance you have of having the inside cooked nice and evenly. And also, it's impossible to just flip a steak once and have like a ribeye like this, like to have both sides seared the same. It's a little more interactive than that. I think we're almost there, so I might take it off and then take the temperature one more time. If it's out of the pan, it's not going to keep cooking, so it's good. It'll buy you a little bit of time to check in with the temperature. Should I put it straight on here?
Sure.
So it feels pretty good to me. We're going to check right here down the eye. So I'm getting anywhere from like 100 degrees to down to like the low 90s.
Right where we want it.
Yeah. So I would guess that this thicker part of the steak is going to be maybe a little on the rare side, where up here it's going to be more mid-rare. But we won't really know until we slice into it.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pull it.
I mean, I think that's also a big pro tip for everyone at home. It's like, you can slice your steak open and see where you're at,
Oh,
too.
yeah. It's the best way to do it. So now I would let it rest for like 20 minutes. So to reheat it, like right before we're gonna serve it, after 20 minutes rest, it's still a little warm to the touch. I'm definitely not worried about it being cold inside, but I do want the outside to get nice and hot again. So we're gonna turn the pan up, I guess, as hot as it goes, because we're just gonna flash it really fast on either side. So I would say if you're cooking for people coming over to your house, you could do this like up to an hour beforehand, and it can really just sit out on your counter and rest for a full hour, and it will not be cold in the center unless you put it in the fridge. So it'll always be somewhat warm in the center, and the outside we can reheat really fast to make the whole steak a little bit warmer. I'm gonna get the pan really hot, and I left all the fat that came off while we were cooking it. At this point, you could throw in some butter, and then as it's reheating, baste it in the butter. You could throw in some crushed garlic or some rosemary or some sage leaves. All of that's delicious, but sometimes it's nice just to get the pure like beefy flavor. All right, so the pan is nice and hot. So this part goes fairly quickly. We're really just trying to reheat the outside as quickly as possible. If you do this too low, you could risk overcooking the steak, so I would say just get your pan as hot as you can before you put your steak in it. All right, we can tell it's hot on the outside when the fat kind of re-warms and is bubbling. This is where you want to be careful because the fat is really, really hot. See that? All right, I'm gonna go ahead and take this out. All right, so then for slicing these, it's really easy. You're basically just going to cut alongside the bone as close as you can get it. Now, usually this part looks a little more rare than you would expect, like closer to the bone is gonna be a little more rare. And then you just rotate, and if you go this way, you're going against the grain. Now this part at the end is mostly fat, but that's delicious. Somebody loves that part. But like we said earlier, you can expect here at the front where it's thinner to be a little bit closer to medium, and then back here we have a nice mid-rare.
But that is our single bone rib roast. You know, all said and done, took us a half hour start to finish, about 45 minutes, you know, including a 15-minute rest. But let's try some, huh?
Yeah.
You have a very thin band of the crust here and a nice even temperature here.
Extra piece.
And this one's for me.
It's good.
Juicy.
Great crust. Wow.
It's like, I think a good steak should be almost salty. So,
But it's also, you know, it can take a lot. And this is a thick piece of meat. You're not gonna get that center portion perfectly seasoned, so. But thank you, Hannah, that was a wonderful steak.
Just wanted to be tasty.
yeah.
Yeah.